A latte that costs 80 cents to make and sells for $5.50, an 85% profit margin higher than almost any product in retail. And still, more than half of the cafes built around that exact math will be closed within 5 years. That's not a coffee problem. That's a number most people never see until it's already too late to fix. Opening a cafe right now typically costs somewhere between $90,000 and $350,000, depending on one decision most first-time owners don't understand until they've already signed the lease. In the next 18 minutes, I'm breaking down exactly where that money goes, why an 85% margin somehow turns into single digits by the time it reaches the owner's pocket, and what the real numbers look like for two completely different versions of this business: the small neighborhood shop and the flagship that pushes past $1 million a year. The first fork in the road happens before you've signed anything, and it determines almost everything else about your budget. You're either taking over a space that used to be a restaurant or cafe, which means the plumbing, the grease trap, the ventilation hood, and the electrical capacity are already there, or you're walking into a raw commercial shell, which means you're paying to build all of that from nothing. That difference alone can swing your build-out cost by well over $100,000. A second-generation space, one that already has the bones a food and beverage business needs, might only require cosmetic work, new flooring, a fresh counter, updated lighting, paint. That kind of build-out for a modest 900 to 1,100 square foot space typically lands between $40,000 and $80,000. A raw shell, on the other hand, means paying a contractor to run new plumbing line, install a commercial hood system, upgrade the electrical panel to handle espresso equipment, and pour new flooring rated for commercial kitchen use. Construction costs like that currently run somewhere between $85 and $160 per square foot, depending on your market, which means the same 1,000 square foot space can cost $85,000 to $160,000 in construction alone before a single chair has been purchased. Equipment is the second major line item, and it's where a lot of first-time owners either wildly underspend or wildly overspend. A serviceable two-group espresso machine from a mid-tier commercial brand starts around $6,000, while a premium machine from one of the well-known Italian or American manufacturers can run $18,000 to $25,000. You'll need at least two grinders, refrigeration unit, a drip brewer capable of high volume, an ice machine, a point-of-sale system, and enough small wares and furniture to actually seat customers. All in, a realistic equipment budget for a specialty-focused independent cafe sits between $28,000 and $55,000. Add those two categories together, along with the deposit and setup costs we'll cover next, and a genuinely honest total startup figure for a mid-sized independent cafe in an average American city lands somewhere between $140,000 and $260,000, plus a working capital reserve most first-time owners badly underestimate, which we'll get to shortly. Here's the part of cafe economics that quietly kills more businesses than bad coffee ever has, and it happens before the shop has served a single customer. Two friends, Sarah and Mia, once looked at the exact same block for their respective coffee shop plans 2 years apart. Sarah found a corner unit with beautiful natural light and steady foot traffic, and signed a 5-year lease at $5,200 a month because the location felt undeniable. Mia found a slightly less glamorous spot 2 blocks over, half a block off the main strip, with less visible signage but a monthly rent of $2,900. Sarah's shop looked better in every early photo. Mia's math worked better in every single month that followed. Landlords typically require first month, last month, and a security deposit equal to 1 to 3 months of rent before handing over keys to anything, which means before a single dollar of construction has happened, you can already be $12,000 to $40,000 into the project just from lease deposit. That's before permit, before health department inspections, before your point of sale software subscription, before your opening inventory of beans, milk, cups, and syrup. The real danger isn't the deposit, though. It's the monthly number itself, because unlike almost every other cost in this business, rent doesn't flex with a slow month. Industry guidance for food and beverage businesses generally puts a healthy rent ceiling at around 10 to 14% of total revenue. Above that, even a genuinely well-run cafe with loyal customers and a tight menu starts fighting a structural math problem that better coffee, better service, or a better Instagram account cannot fix. Sarah's beautiful corner unit ended up sitting at nearly 19% of her actual revenue once the numbers came in. She didn't have a coffee problem. She had a lease problem that was locked in for 5 years the day she signed it. Here's the number that gets thrown around constantly in conversations about starting a cafe, and it's technically true, which is exactly what makes it so misleading. A specialty latte selling for $5.50 typically costs somewhere between 75 cents and $1 to actually produce, once you account for the espresso shot, the milk, any flavored syrup, the cup, the lid, and the sleeve. That works out to a gross margin north of 80%, often closer to 85%. A simple drip coffee is even more extreme, with a gross margin that can push past 90%. For comparison, a typical grocery store operates on margins closer to 25 to 30%. A cafe achieves triple that on every single cup, dozens or hundreds of times a day. But that number describes the drink, not the business. Between that 85% gross margin and whatever actually lands in the owner's pocket at the end of the year sits an enormous compression, one that most first-time owners never fully appreciate until they're living inside it. By the time labor, rent, ingredients beyond the drink itself, utilities, insurance, software, marketing, and equipment maintenance have all taken their share, that 85% gross margin on a latte typically compresses down to somewhere between 3% and 15% net profit margin on the overall business. The gap between those two numbers, 85% and maybe 10%, is essentially the entire story of what it actually means to run a cafe. If rent is the trap that catches people at the very beginning, labor is the cost that quietly determines whether the business survives every single week after that. A well-run independent specialty cafe generally needs labor to sit somewhere between 27% and 34% of total revenue, keep the overall math functional. Push much past 36 or 37%, and the business starts losing money even during weeks with strong customer counts, because the payroll simply outpaces what the margin structure can absorb. Drop labor too far below 25%, chasing efficiency and service quality typically suffers just enough that customers notice, tip less, and slowly stop coming back as often, which creates a slower, quieter version of the same problem. What makes labor especially unforgiving compared to almost every other cost on this list is that it doesn't scale down cleanly during a slow period. You still need someone opening the shop at 5:45 in the morning to start the espresso machine and prep the pastry case. Whether Tuesday turns out to be busy or dead, minimum wage increases across a growing number of states in recent years have only tightened this further, meaning the labor percentage that worked comfortably 3 years ago often no longer fits the same business today without a corresponding increase in either prices or volume. Beyond labor and rent, the remaining costs stack up quietly but add real weight to the total picture. Cost of goods sold, meaning the actual coffee, milk, syrups, food items, if you serve any, cups, lids, and packaging, typically runs between 24% and 34% of revenue, with the number climbing higher for cafes that build out a real food menu alongside their coffee program. Utilities for a space running commercial refrigeration and an espresso machine that never fully powers down can run $600 to $1,400 a month depending on your market and season. Insurance, point-of-sale software subscriptions, basic marketing, and ongoing equipment maintenance round out the rest, typically consuming another 6% to 10% of revenue combined. Add every category together together, and total operating cost for a typical independent cafe lands somewhere between 78% and 88% of revenue before the owner sees a dollar. What's left, that final 12% to 22%, still has to cover loan payment if you financed any part of the build-out, taxes, and whatever the owner actually pays themselves, which is why the commonly cited net profit margin for a mature, well-run independent cafe sits closer to 8% to 15%, with the industry-wide average, once you include underperforming shops and franchise locations, landing closer to 4% to 7%. Here's the part of cafe economics that surprises almost every first-time owner, usually around month 3, right when the initial excitement has worn off. The overwhelming majority of a typical cafe's daily revenue arrives in a window of roughly 4 hours, generally between 7 in the morning and 11. With the single busiest stretch usually falling between 8 and 10. During that window, a well-located cafe can be genuinely slammed, line out the door, every seat full, the espresso machine running non-stop, and then, somewhere around 1 in the afternoon, the shop quietly empties out and stays that way for the next 4 or 5 hours until closing. The problem this creates is structural, not seasonal. You're paying rent for the full day. You're paying for the lease, the insurance, and the utilities across all 12 hours you're open. But the revenue that actually justifies those costs is concentrated into a window that's over before most people have eaten lunch. A shop that does $900 in sales between 7 and 11 in the morning might do another $150 total across the entire afternoon, which means the afternoon hours are effectively operating at a loss on a standalone basis, subsidized entirely by the morning rush. The cafes that consistently outperform their neighborhood competitors tend to share one specific trait, and it usually has nothing to do with the quality of their espresso. They've built a reason for people to come in after 1 p.m., a modest food program, sandwiches and pastries that turn the shop into a lunch destination instead of just a coffee stop, can add a genuinely meaningful second revenue window. Some shops add a limited beer and wine license for evening hours, turning the same physical space into something closer to a wine bar after 5 p.m., using square footage that would otherwise sit empty. Others lean into retail, selling bagged beans, branded mugs, and merchandise that generates revenue from customers who aren't even ordering a drink that visit. A cafe owner named Derek ran a shop for 2 years that lived almost entirely off its morning rush, watching the same predictable afternoon slump every single day. When he finally added a small lunch menu, 4 sandwiches, a soup rotation, nothing complicated, his total daily revenue didn't just tick up slightly. It restructured the entire shape of his day, adding roughly 30% to daily sales almost immediately. Not because his coffee got better, but because he finally gave the building a second reason to be visited. Here's the number that tends to stop the conversation whenever it comes up. Somewhere between half and nearly 3/4 of independent coffee shops close within their first 5 years of operation. That statistic isn't meant to scare anyone out of the idea. It's meant to correct a very specific and very common misunderstanding about why those closures actually happen. Surveys of independent cafe owners close their doors consistently point to the same handful of reasons, and bad coffee is almost never one of them. The most commonly cited cause is being structurally unprepared for the full operational complexity of running a small food and beverage business. Everything from staffing schedule to health inspections to supplier relationships, underestimated before opening and overwhelming once the doors are actually open. The second most common reason is a lack of any real differentiation. A shop that looks and tastes almost identical to 3 other options nearby, competing purely on convenience in a category where convenience alone rarely builds the kind of loyalty that survives a slow winter. Underneath both of those reasons sits the same root cause we've walked through this entire video. A rent number that quietly sat 2 or 3 points above what the location could realistically support. A labor percentage that crept up during a busy season and never came back down. A working capital reserve that looked sufficient on paper and evaporated during a slower than expected first winter. Coffee, in almost every documented case, was rarely the actual problem. Most new cafes take somewhere between 6 months and a year and a half to reach consistent, reliable profitability, and that ramp-up period is exactly where the working capital reserve either saves the business or the business quietly runs out of runway. During those first months, rent arrives on the first of the month, whether your morning rush has found its regulars yet or not. Payroll runs on schedule regardless of whether last Tuesday was slow. Suppliers expect payment on their normal terms even during the week. Your point of sale system crashed for 2 days. The cafes that survive this window almost universally share one trait. They opened with enough cash reserved specifically to absorb 4 to 6 genuinely slow months without making desperate decisions. Cutting a staff member who was actually essential to the morning rush, watering down the coffee program to save on cost of goods, or skipping a piece of equipment maintenance that turns into a much larger repair bill 3 months later. A realistic working capital reserve for a mid-sized independent cafe generally sits between $50,000 and $100,000, held separately from the build-out and equipment budget specifically to cover this exact runway period. Let's put actual numbers around 2 different versions of this business, because the honest answer to is a cafe a good investment depends entirely on which one you're actually building. Scenario A, the neighborhood cafe, spend $130,000 on build-out and equipment combined, reserve $55,000 in working capital, and open in a mid-sized American city with monthly rent around $2,800. By year 2, once your morning rush has stabilized, you're averaging roughly $750 to $950 a day, which works out to annual revenue somewhere between $270,000 and $340,000. At a 10% net margin, that's $27,000 to $34,000 in annual profit. At a well-optimized 14% margin, it climbs to $38,000 to $48,000. That's the realistic ceiling for most small independent cafes that never expand beyond their original footprint. And for a lot of owners, that number, combined with actually owning and running the place they built, is exactly the outcome they wanted. Scenario B, the flagship cafe with a real food program. You spend $320,000 to $420,000 on a larger 1,500 to 1,800 square foot space in a high-traffic urban location. Build a genuine food menu alongside the coffee program and add evening hours. By year 3, a well-run version of this business generates $650,000 to $950,000 in annual revenue. At a 12% to 16% net margin, that's $78,000 to $150,000 in annual profit. The best performing independent flagship cafes, the ones with a strong lunch program, evening revenue, and a customer base built over several years of consistency, can push past $1 million in annual revenue, with margins approaching 18% to 20% in their most mature years. That's a genuinely excellent small business. It's also one of the operationally hardest businesses to run at that scale, because every one of the tolerances we've covered in this video, the rent ceiling, the labor percentage, the working capital cushion, gets tighter and less forgiving as the revenue number grows. Not a bad outcome for a product that costs less than $1 to make and sells for $5. But the businesses that actually reach that outcome are never the ones with the prettiest exposed brick or the most photogenic pour-over setup, even though those details genuinely matter to customers. They're run by people who understood the real math before they ever signed a lease, kept rent under roughly 12% of revenue, held labor in that narrow 27% to 34% band, built a working capital reserve large enough to survive a genuinely slow first winter, and found a real reason for customers to walk back in after the morning rush ended. The coffee was never really the hard part. 4 hours after it was.